On April 23, 1972, two men in pressurized suits sat inside a spindly four-legged lander called Orion, parked on the lunar surface at the Descartes Highlands, and they had no idea whether they were allowed to get out. Not because of a mechanical failure on their end. Not because of a medical emergency. They were waiting on a phone call from Houston to find out if the entire mission still existed. To understand why, you have to back up 2 years, to a man named Thomas Kenneth Mattingly. In April 1970, Mattingly was 3 days from launching on Apollo 13 when flight surgeons pulled him from the crew. A crewmate had been exposed to rubella. Mattingly showed no symptoms and never got sick. He watched from the ground as Apollo 13's oxygen tank exploded 200,000 miles out, and spent 4 days helping engineer the procedures that brought his colleagues home alive. Then he went back to training, quietly, for his own turn. That turn was Apollo 16. Mattingly would pilot the command module Casper while Commander John Young, a laconic test pilot who had already flown Gemini and Apollo 10, descended to the surface with rookie Charles Duke. The launch from Cape Canaveral on April 16 was textbook. The transit to the moon was smooth. Young and Duke climbed into Orion and separated cleanly. Then Mattingly, alone in Casper, ran a routine check on the backup steering system for the main engine. The gimbal motor was oscillating. Faintly, but measurably, and wrong. Here is the problem. If that backup system failed during the engine burn that would lift Young and Duke off the moon, the primary system would have to work perfectly, with no fallback. Mission rules were unambiguous: a crew could not land if the backup was compromised. But the crew had already landed. For 6 hours, Young and Duke sat inside Orion on the Descartes Highlands, fully suited, unable to begin their moonwalk, while engineers in Houston argued over telemetry printouts and probability calculations. The debate in mission control was genuine and pointed. Some engineers wanted to abort immediately, bring the lander back up before the window closed. Others argued the oscillation was within acceptable margins, that the primary system was robust, that aborting would be the overcautious choice. Flight Director Jerry Griffin finally polled his teams. The vote came back: go. After 6 hours and 3 minutes of sitting on the moon doing nothing, John Young opened the hatch. What followed was 3 days of lunar fieldwork that geologists would spend decades unpacking. Young drove the battery-powered lunar roving vehicle across 27 kilometers of highland terrain, the most distance covered on any single Apollo mission. Duke collected rocks that turned out to be among the oldest samples ever returned from the moon, some dated to 4 billion years ago. Young, characteristically, picked up a rock, looked at it, and described it as a big mother. Mattingly, orbiting alone above them, used the service module's mapping camera to photograph nearly the entire lunar surface, intelligence that would inform every subsequent mission planning discussion for a generation. And the backup gimbal motor? It never failed. The oscillation remained faint and steady for the entire mission. When Young and Duke lifted off 3 days later, the primary engine fired perfectly, and Casper caught them without incident. Ken Mattingly splashed down in the Pacific on April 27, 1972, having never contracted rubella. The 4-billion-year-old rocks Young and Duke collected are still studied today. And somewhere in a NASA archive, there is a 6-hour gap in the Apollo 16 transcript, nothing but hold music and engineering argument, which is, depending on your perspective, either the most boring or the most suspenseful stretch of tape in the history of exploration. Strip away the drama and 3 things remain: a motor oscillated slightly, 2 men sat on the moon for 6 hours waiting for a room they'd never enter to decide their fate, and the people in that room made a call. They couldn't guarantee. The gimbal never failed. The rocks came home. Mattingly, the man who'd watched his colleagues nearly die while he stood on the ground, made it back too. None of that proves the decision was correct. It proves that exploration at this scale has always been a series of arguments resolved by a poll, followed by silence, followed by someone opening a hatch. What strikes us isn't the moonwalk or the 4-billion-year-old rocks. It's the 6 hours. We keep coming back to that gap in the transcript, hold music and engineering argument, while two men in pressurized suits sat completely still, waiting. We don't think that's a story about NASA. We think it's a story about how consequential decisions actually get made, out of sight, under a clock no one wants to name, by people doing their best with numbers that almost add up. Which makes us wonder, how many times have you been the one in the lander, waiting on a call you didn't know was happening,